sight of each other's humanity and never let down our guard. To all who confront prejudice and persecution, let us clearly say, you are not alone. The United Nations stands with you.
We have listened to the word of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Let us now reflect and remember at the lights of the candles that will be lit in this room and observe a minute of silence. I would like to invite Mrs. Tatiana Balovaya, Director General of the UN Geneva, Ambassador Meirav Eilon Shahar, Permanent Representative of Israel to the UN Office at Geneva, Ambassador Lotte Knudsen, Head of the Permanent Delegation of the European Union to the UN Office at Geneva, Mrs. Marta Raviv, Holocaust survivor, and Naama, Eli, and Ethan to come to the table to light the candles. Let us now, all of us, stand, please, and observe a minute of silence. Thank you very much. It is now my honor to invite Mrs. Tatiana Balovaya, Director General of UN Geneva, to come to the rostrum to deliver her remarks. Director General.
Dear Ms. Marta Raviv, Ambassador Eilon Shahar, Ambassador Knudsen, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you for joining this commemoration. Every year on 27th of January, we honor the memory of the 6 million Jewish men, women and children, as well as over 500,000 Roma and Sinti and other targeted groups and individuals who perished in the horror of the Holocaust. Every year on this day, we reaffirm our unwavering commitment to counter anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of intolerance. The theme of this year's commemoration is recognizing the extraordinary courage of victims and survivors of the Holocaust. Time is relentless. Holocaust survivors are dwindling with each passing year, and it is our duty for the future generations to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. The United Nations Office at Geneva remains committed to providing a platform for survivors to share their memories. Today, I feel extremely honored to welcome Ms. Marta Raviv, whose father was imprisoned and later murdered in the gas chamber in Bernburg, and I wish to thank her for being with us today and for bearing witness so that others may hear from her and learn from her remarkable courage and resilience. The Holocaust profoundly affected countries in which Nazi crimes were perpetrated. It also had global implications and consequences in other parts of the world. Therefore, Member States share a collective responsibility for addressing the residual trauma and promoting greater awareness 8 decades after the Holocaust. This responsibility entails educating citizens about the root causes, consequences, and dynamics of such crimes, and to strengthen the resilience of young people against ideologies of hatred. In January 2022, the United Nations General Assembly adopted by consensus the resolution entitled Holocaust Denial, which urged member states and social media companies to take active measures to combat anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial or distortion in cyberspace, including through educational programs. Education is indeed one of the best tools at our disposal to prevent all forms of intolerance and discrimination, to defend fundamental freedoms, and to ensure that human rights are respected everywhere. The annual commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust at the Palais des Nations is a very important part of the United Nations Holocaust Outreach Programme. With our partners, we will continue to develop and implement activities aimed at countering Holocaust denial and distortion and educate future generations about the lessons of the Holocaust. Despite history's harsh lessons, we live today in a world of global disruption in trust and human solidarity. Hate speech has been a precursor to many atrocity crimes, including genocide. As it is often said, genocide is a process, not an event. The Holocaust did not start with the gas chambers. It started with hate speech. Xenophobic and racist discourse, both offline and online, represent the scourge of our times. It is our shared responsibility to combat hate speech. We can and must raise awareness about its dangers. We must work collectively to prevent and end it in all its forms. The United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, launched in 2019, is our comprehensive framework for tackling the causes and impacts of hate speech, in line with the international human rights standards. The United Nations Working Group on Hate Speech, comprised of 16 UN entities, UN country teams, and UN peace operations and political missions around the world, is fully mobilized to implement activities based on this strategy and plan of action. Education initiatives, positive speech campaigns, research to understand and address root causes, and efforts to promote inclusion and equal rights all have an important role in our joint efforts. The work is also underway to develop a voluntary code of conduct for information integrity on digital platforms, aimed at reducing the spread of mis- and disinformation and hate speech while protecting freedom of expression. Ahead of the Summit of the Future next September, I encourage Member States, technology companies, and other relevant stakeholders to support the United Nations work in this direction. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres just reminded us, today, especially in the wake of the abhorrent 7 October terror attacks by Hamas, we must resolve to stand up against the forces of hate and division. At the time when geopolitical divides are hampering efforts to address global threats, combating all forms of hatred and intolerance requires greater solidarity and a firm commitment from all of us to promote a culture of peace. Let me quote Viktor Frankl, world-famous author and psychotherapist, as well as Holocaust survivor, who once said, "The world is in a bad state, but everything will become still worse unless each of us does his best." So today, let us commit to do our best. Let us increase our joint efforts to rebuild trust, to promote inclusive, just, and peaceful societies, and to protect the rights and dignity of all, everywhere. Our world is multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious, and this diversity is a richness, not a threat. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear Director General. I would now like to invite Ambassador Merav Eilun Shahar, Permanent Representative of Israel to the UN office at Geneva, to come to the rostrum to lead the remarks. Ambassador.
Dear Ms. Marta Raviv, Director General Tatiana Valovaya, ambassadors, dear friends and colleagues, today is the day we stand together in solemn reflection, honoring the memory of the millions of the innocent lives taken during the Holocaust, the darkest chapter of human history. Today is the day we remember unprecedented genocide of the Jewish people, total and systematic, perpetrated by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. We stand together not just to remember the horrors of the past, but to reflect on unimaginable courage displayed by those who suffered, those who met unspeakable cruelty with unwavering strength. We stand together united in the need to confront the past in order to shape a better future. The Holocaust did not start with the industrialized mass killing. It began much earlier with pogroms around Europe. It began with the dehumanization, the beatings, the killings of the Jewish people when it became normal. The Hamas massacre of October 7th brought us back for a moment to those dark times. At dawn, terrorists entered Israel. By dusk, over 1,200 people lay dead. Hundreds were taken to Gaza. 136 remain. And once again, the Jewish people are being told that their lives do not matter, that their suffering is to be contextualized, that their rape is not worth global condemnation. This indifference to the suffering of our people, as Hamas burnt entire families alive in their homes, is the same indifference which allowed the world to look away 80 years ago. Unfortunately, this indifference plagues the very halls I speak in today, the very organizations that preach human rights, the very institutions born out of the ashes of Birkenau, Sobibor, or Treblinka, established on the premise of never again. Today, we are once again witnessing a sharp and dramatic rise in anti-Semitism. Let me be clear. The rise occurred on October 7th, the very day Israelis were dying in their homes, as Jews were being murdered in their beds. Jew hatred spiked around the world. We must urgently act to ensure that the Jewish people can live safely and Jewish life can thrive, be it in Kfar Aza or Geneva, New York or Kibbutz Be'eri. It is why testimonies of survivors such as Marta Raviv, which we will hear later today, are so important. The horrors of the Shoah are too big to grasp, but the testimony of one is powerful to understand what took place. Marta is a symbol of hope, a symbol of light, a symbol of how one can overcome such evil with such fortitude. And it is by her example which the Israeli people must act now. With her courage, with the strength and resilience of the survivors of the Shoah as an example, we must overcome the evil from which we have suffered. We must look at history as a lesson. The atrocities of the Holocaust were a revelation of the depths to which humankind can fall. It was an abyss of darkness, a stark reminder of the consequences of prejudice, hatred, and indifference. Yet those who came out of this abyss did not just survive, they thrived. We, the Jewish people, as well as the descendants of all victims of Nazism, will forever carry this with us as a lesson for generations to come.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ambassador. I would now like to invite Ambassador Lotte Knudsen, Head of the Permanent Delegation of the European Union to the UN Office at Geneva, to come to the rostrum to deliver her remarks. Ambassador.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, and most of all, dear Martha Raviv, thank you very much for being with us here today. A Molotov cocktail thrown at a synagogue in Germany, a Jewish cemetery desecrated in Austria, Jewish stores and synagogues attacked in Spain. One would expect these incidents were stories from the past, yet they are not. They are examples from recent weeks. The spike of anti-Semitic incidents across Europe has reached extraordinary levels in the last few months, as tensions and conflict flared up again in the Middle East following the horrific attack of 7th October. We condemn all anti-Semitic acts in the strongest possible terms. They go against everything we stand for. Our message is clear. Nothing justifies anti-Semitism. The United Nations was born in the aftermath of the Second World War under the founding principle of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. World War II brought acts of unimaginable horror. The Holocaust, the brutal, senseless murder of 6 million Jews and other people based on their origin or status by the Nazis. Tragically, the irrational hatred of Jews that led to the Shoah has not disappeared, and European Jews today are again living in fear. Holocaust denial, distortion and trivialization are often used to feed hatred against Jewish people in an attempt to rewrite European and Jewish history. The corrosive effect for the resilience and cohesion of our democratic societies should not be underestimated and need to be urgently addressed. Recent studies have found concerning levels of Holocaust denial and distortion and disinformation on social media platforms. It shows that perpetrators learn to evade content moderation by using humorous and parodic memes as a strategy intended to normalize anti-Semitic ideas. The European Commission last week published a new communication entitled "No Place for Hate, a Europe United Against Hatred." This paper also addresses the explosion of anti-Semitic hate speech and conspiracy myths online. This month, in January 24, a new initiative was launched by the Commission as well to counter Holocaust denial and distortion, targeting specifically educators and media professionals. Our proclamation of never again must go beyond rhetoric. It is our shared responsibility to call out hate in all its forms and stand up against it. Let us carry forward the weight of this collective reminder as a commitment to never forget the values of human dignity, equality, and tolerance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ambassador. We will now listen to a brief musical interlude, which is brought to us by pianist Evgenia Pileyina and violinist Maxim Sinitsky. Thank you very much for this beautiful performance. And it is now my honor and my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mrs. Marta Raviv, a Holocaust survivor. Mrs. Raviv traveled all the way from Israel to Geneva with her family to tell us her story. Dear Mrs. Raviv, please join our colleague, Margot Krieg, to the table. Margot will guide Mrs. Raviv through her narrative.
Shalom, Am Israel Chai. Thanks to everybody who's taken time in order to hear me tell you the story of my life. Not all my life, but the story of my experience during the Holocaust. In July 2023, I volunteered to come here and speak about my story during the Holocaust. I could not see the future. The future is not ours to see, given the latest events. I am here today after the horrific massacre of 1,200 human beings, most of them Jews, who were brutally murdered on 7th October 2023 by Hamas ISIS in the western Negev in Israel. The evidence from that massacre is terrifying. Babies were murdered and the heads were chopped off their bodies. Children tried to escape death under the dead bodies of their parents. Women were shot dead while being raped. These horrors were filmed and documented by the cameras of the murderers themselves. Over 240 men, women, children, and babies were kidnapped by Hamas ISIS. I am here sitting in the Palace of Nations in Geneva. J'accuse the United Nations and especially the Red Cross for doing very little to bring medicines to the hostages, but constantly asking Israel to stop the war in Gaza. The Red Cross did not visit the hostages since the 7th of October, although it regularly visits the Hamas terrorists in the Israeli prisons. I am praying that the 136 hostages, which are still held by Hamas ISIS, and all the Israeli soldiers will return home healthy and well. The world's response to this horrific event reminds me of the world reacted back then, at that time, to the Holocaust. The Holocaust survivors must go on and tell our story, as will do those who survived the October 7th in Israel.
Madam Raviv, thank you so much for being here to share your story with us. I want to start by asking you about the 3 items that you've brought along with you. Would you be able to explain them a bit for us?
First of all, I've brought with me the book which was written by the Historical Commission of Austria, describing what were the rights taken away during the Second World War. In this book, Dr. Hannah Burger was a historian who wrote about me. So if anybody knows German and wants to read by himself the story of my life, is able to read that book. Second item I've brought here, which is usually not something very special, because the badge of Jude was worn by everybody, almost. I was too young to wear it. But this badge has very, very little needlework around it, because in order to stay alive in Vienna at that time, we stayed in Vienna till September 1943, you had to take the badge off in order to go and find something to eat in other parts of Vienna, and in order, especially and mostly, in order to go to the cemetery where there was supposed to be the ashes of my father. There is nothing in that cemetery, only a plaque saying that my father died. I'll tell you about my father, the story afterwards. And the third item I've brought to you is, this was, I think, a shawl, maybe 100 years old, manufactured in Russia. It's woolen stone, it's very big, and my mother used to put this shawl over me, especially when we were in the trains, and the trains were bombarded, and as a child, I was then 6 years old, so what I'm telling you now, think of a child of 6 years, not an old woman like me. This shawl was on my body, and I was laying down on the train, so when the bombs reached the train and the train got up in the air, I would be hurt less than if I would have been not with the shawl. So I brought to show you these items as the story of my life.
Thank you so much for bringing those to show us. They're very, very powerful items. So you did mention, your mother and your father, and you said you would tell us about them, but I first just want to acknowledge all your family who are here with us today. That's really wonderful and special, and we're so happy to have you. But do you maybe want to start your story by telling us about your family, your mother, your father, and your sister?
Yes, of course. I was born in Vienna on 20th January 1936 to a Jewish family. The name of my father was Judah Leib Falkenflick. My mother, Gena Gittel Falkenflick, and my sister, Tzvetka Nitza Falkenfried, 10 years old. Just after the Anschluss, which means the joining of Austria to Germany, my father was arrested and put in prison in Dachau, but he had the luck of coming back and was back in home. But in November 1939, he was taken once more in prison. The prisons were too full, so they found a way to keep the Jewish prisoners in the Soccer Stadium in the Prater of Vienna. There, Dr. Wastel, an anthropologist, used the faces and the whole bodies of the Jewish people in order to show that Jews are not very nice human beings, in a good way to say it. Afterwards, my father was sent to Buchenwald. My mother, who was a very pretty, strong, and wise woman, had to decide what is she going to do, staying back in Vienna with 2 children and a difference of age. There was one way, was it to send us in the Kindertransport, which means Britain agreed to save children, but the difference of age between me and my sister was so big that nobody wanted 2 children with this difference of age, and me as a baby, they only wanted to adopt fully. So my mother had the courage of sending a 12-year-old child by herself from Vienna to the land of Israel. My sister was put on a train. She somehow managed to find a ship which anchored in Trieste in Italy and came to the land of Israel. The ship anchored in Tel Aviv, but she didn't know what to do, so she stayed on the ship. The ship anchored in Haifa. She didn't know what to do, so she stayed on the ship until the sailors found the child and told the captain that one child is left. The captain took my sister to the entrance of the port in Haifa and told her to stay there. She did exactly what she was told, and suddenly there came in front of her her teacher of Hebrew, because my family was Zionist and she had a Hebrew teacher. What she thought, seeing her teacher, was, oh, what a sorrow. I can't tell my friends that the teacher has a girlfriend, not thinking what I'm going to eat or where am I going to sleep. She was really a child of 12 years, a usual child. My sister was taken by her teacher, put on a bus, and later on she came to the family in Petah Tikva, where my mother had a sister, and my sister grew up with that family, and they are even close till today with me, because they grew up and were sure that my sister was theirs. And suddenly comes somebody from 1948 and tells them that she is my sister and only their cousin. But my sister, during the Independence War, worked as a nurse, and later on she was one of the first academic nurses in Israel and the president of the Organization of Nurses in Israel, and she died at the age of 90 with all my family around her. And my father, as I told you, was sent to Buchenwald. He worked there from November 1939 till February 1942. The last letter we received from my father was in a wonderful handwriting, which meant that he was a healthy man. On the other side, my mother received a telegram telling her that my father died from a heart attack, and she could pay for the ashes of my father in order to bury them in the cemetery in Vienna. In the year 2003, I, for the first time, learned to know that my father did not die of a heart attack, but he was sent to Bernburg, an hospital of euthanasia, and there were gas chambers, and in fact, he was murdered in a gas chamber in Bernburg in Germany. And I remember always how hard it was for me, even though my mother, as I told you, could take off the badge and we could go to the cemetery, but you wouldn't go off the tram at the Jewish cemetery, because the Jewish cemetery was, the entrance was 4 entrances later, and if you go there, you would be shot, because you are not allowed as a Jew to go from the second district of Vienna anywhere, any place else. And that's why the badge has been so and so many times on and taken off in order that we could visit the cemetery, which in fact, as I told you, nothing of my father, but only a tombstone is there, and me and my family, usually, every time we visit Vienna, we go there knowing that it's only a symbol and not a grave. That's about my father. And now I'll come about myself. We lived in Vienna in the 3rd district in a big flat, but we had to let other families come to the fat Jewish families, and after some time we were sent to the 2nd district of Vienna, which I called was a ghetto, although Austria doesn't say it, and we were sent from one place to another to live in that ghetto. My mother, I don't know how, I don't know why, had the wonderful idea, and she got a document from the Swedish consulate telling that the Swedish consulate is taking care of my mother and me as we are Russian citizens. And in fact, this document saved our lives. We stayed, as I told you, in Vienna until September 1943, where we met in the prison a group of Russian citizens. All of them had real Russian passports, but only my mother and me had this special document, and so we had a very special way of surviving. What we didn't know, because in October, November 1943, the war was not going on for the German army in Russia as they thought they would, and they had determined that they could use Russian citizens in order to be exchanged for German Nazi prisoners. So we were taken, as I told you, in a special group from the prison in Vienna to other prisons. I will talk and tell you only about 3 prisons or 3 places we were in. First, we came to the prison in Prague, which was called Pancras. And for first time I loved the cell there better, because it was with whiter walls than the cell in Vienna. But when we arrived at the prison, they told us to stand with our face at the wall and not to move. It was 6 in the morning, and in our group there was one man who had a shorter leg. He just stood at the wall across the door near me. When his foot, the shortest foot, touched the floor, it was answered with a shot, and his cadaver fell through the door. That was my first encounters with murder as a child, 6 years old. From the prison of Pancras in Prague, we were sent to the prison in Halle an der Saale. Halle an der Saale is a big town in Germany, and was for me the worst prison to be in, because the cell where we were put into was full of criminals, murderers, and thieves, and there was no place to move. I could only find myself a very, very little place to sit And all my life afterwards, I always repeat that I dreamt of 1 square meter of freedom. That was the only thing I wished to find. And the door of the cell was opened in the morning, and the ward asked my mother, "Where is the child?" The child is here. So, I want a child. We have a group of Sinti and Romani children downstairs. She should come to the children. My mother said, "No. The child stays with me." The answer was that he broke her a tooth in her mouth. But you see me, I'm here. Years after, I saw an interview of the president of the Sinti and Romani, who was interviewed in Berlin at the place where the memory of the Holocaust. And the press asked him, "No, I'm sure at Sinti and Romani you probably have a lot of children." The answer of the president, "I've not even one." I was in the prison in Halle an der Saale. We were the experiment of Dr. Mengele. I never have children. I could never bear children. And here you see me, grandmother of all my dear grandchildren, most of them who have accompanied me here. This is just a piece of a present of God I had. From Hildesheim, from Halle an der Saale, the next present to come there was Hildesheim. But to know, for you to know, you never knew what will be the next station. Where is the train going? Is it going east or is it going west? If it's going east, for sure, you go to Auschwitz. If it's going west, perhaps you will survive. And we had a sort of very special train, which was a train designed specially for prisoners. And we were put into the cabin where we found that already were the 2 young girls, Yugoslavian girls, and it was a very, very hot autumn day. The cell was very small, and the sun came into that cell, and we almost suffocated. One of the girls who was with us in the cell had shoes that at that time, when you had shoes with a leather sole, you could put nails on it in order to keep the sole not wet when you walk on the snow. And she decided with that when the engine of the locomotive will go fast, there will be a lot of noise, and the shoe will try, the nails will go and break the glass of the window. It's not so easy because it had two fences from both sides, very thick one, and it was just sheer luck that the nails could penetrate and broke. And this was how we survived the train. When the train stopped, again, one of our group had suffocated on the train, and we were put, as usually, after you come down from a train and come into another prison, you are counted. When they used to, the Nazi count you, this was called an appel. And when we stood at that appel, our neighbor, who almost suffocated on the train, was going to fall down near my mother. My mother did the most impossible thing. She asked the commander for a chair. And he asked her, "Is the chair for you?" "No," my mother said, "it's for my neighbor. One of our group has already suffocated and died on the way. I'm afraid that my neighbor is going to fall down and she'll die also." Believe it or not, the commander of the prison gave the neighbor of my mother a chair, and she survived. This was prison of Hildesheim. From Hildesheim, we get on in trucks, trains, arriving in Celle north of Germany, and from there we were put into a truck, a very dark one, and because I once almost fell out of a truck, I was put very near the cabin of the driver, and I found a little place in that truck where I could see how the truck was going. And of course, the group, the big girl of 6 years, describes the way of the truck. We start in an alley, a wonderful alley, and I describe it. We arrive at the entrance of Bergen-Belsen. And there I look and I see the big German shepherd dogs running after men in stripes until they fall over electricity cables and were murdered. This was a story. At the age of 6, I decided not to repeat to the group. For years, I thought maybe it was imagination. 20 years ago, I saw a film about Bergen-Belsen, and there they showed that picture. So, as once I was asked if sometime I can tell that I'd have done something by myself, so I think it was the most important decision a child of 6 years can get in not telling the truth to the group to where we were coming. In Bergen-Belsen, I don't talk about much, but well, I'll repeat about the disinfection. Disinfection, I don't know if people here know, means you should be clean enough and so in order you get washed. So first of all, they tell you to go into a room, take off all your clothes, no matter if you are women or men, take off your clothes, and then send you in the other room, and on the top of the ceiling of the other room, there were the places for douche, for getting, we were sure that it will be water, but they started not with water, they started with steam. All the people in our group were so frightened because they were sure that we are going to get gassed. So instinctively, everybody shouted the only prayer every Jew knows, Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu. God, hear Israel. On the other side of the wall, there sat the Nazis, and they started to laugh. Hearing on one side the prayer and the laugh on the other side, I always shut my ears, because it was so terrible to hear this. But as you see me, this we also escaped. And from Bergen-Belsen, we were sent again by train. Again, as I told you, not knowing if east or west, only after seeing the stations, and there, especially the trains, the war went on, and the bombs were, Germany was already heavily bombed, and with the signs on, we saw that we are getting near the river Rhine. I was terribly, terribly frightened that with all these bombs on, how will the train pass the river? But as I told you, this kept me alive on the floor of the train, and the first town we found was, the sign of it was Strasbourg. So we were heading west and not east. The next camp where the train stopped was Vittel. We arrived in Vittel, and there, to our astonishment, we were encountered by the poet of the Shoah, Yitzhak Katzenelson, who told us, thank God you have arrived safely, not knowing that a few months later, he was put on a train. From that train, nobody survived. We had the luck, stayed on in Vittel until we were liberated in October 1944. From there, we are put to displaced persons camps. The first one was La Bourboule in Massif Central in France, in the part of France which was already liberated, and from La Bourboule on to the Hautes-Pyrénées to the Pyrenees. We were in a displaced camp in Lourdes. And there I want, because I'm asked here if I talk French. In Lourdes, I was in school, and a Catholic school, and I learned French, and that's why I can speak French, but I've forgotten a lot of it. But sometimes, if somebody asks me again, and I see the smiles of my grandchildren who have heard me for, I don't know, by chance, I'm able to tell my story in French for 1 hour, the story of my life, if it comes back. And here, 1948, in fact, we left France and came to the land of Israel to meet my sister in Israel.
Madam Raviv, thank you so much for sharing your inspirational story with us. It's so inspiring for all of us here and for many generations to come, and I feel so fortunate to have sat here and talked with you, and I'm sure everyone in this room and all of those watching around the world agree. So thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Mrs. Raviv, for telling us your incredible story of resilience and courage, and also the one of your mother, who must have been a remarkable woman to stand up like that to the Nazis. I would now like to invite our pianist, Mrs. Evgenia Piliavina, and the violinist, Maxim Sininsky, to play a final musical interlude. Thank you.
Lera Auerbach, תפילה. Joseph Kaminski, récitatif et danse.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Piliavina and Mr. Sininsky, for this beautiful performance that takes us to the end of our commemoration today. I would like to thank everyone for attending it here in the room and those who have followed us online. Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.